The desert doesn't give you answers. It just makes you forget the questions. That's what Clay Maddox told himself anyway. For 15 years, the dust had been his only companion, the wind his only gospel. He rode a tired Mustang, followed by a grizzled mutt named Bandit, and carried the kind of silence that rings louder than a gunshot. He was heading nowhere, and he was in no hurry to get there. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the rocks in shades of rust and old blood. It was God's country, they called it. If that was true, then God had long since packed up and left. This stretch of hell was called Dead Echo Pass, a place where sound went to die and travelers were never heard from again. It was the perfect place for a man with nothing left to lose. Which is why, when Bandit stopped dead in his tracks, hair bristling on his neck, and let out a bark that sounded like tearing metal, Clay pulled the reins so hard his Mustang snorted in protest. He trusted that dog more than he trusted his own memories. "What is it, boy?" Clay's voice was gravel, unused and rough. Bandit wasn't looking at the horizon. He wasn't sniffing for snakes. He was staring at the ground, circling a small mound of sand, barking like the devil himself was clawing his way up from below. Clay swung a leg over his horse, his boots crunching on sun-baked earth. His hand, by instinct alone, rested on the cold butt of the revolver at his hip. The desert loved to play tricks. He'd seen mirages of shining cities and ghosts of fallen comrades. He wasn't about to be fooled by a pile of sand. He kicked at the dirt with the toe of his boot, and he saw a hand. It was curled like a dead leaf, skin cracked and blistered, but it was a human hand. Clay's blood ran cold. He knelt down, scraping away the sand and grit with a frantic energy he hadn't felt in years. It was a girl, or a woman, hard to tell. Her face was a mask of dust and dried blood, her lips split open. She looked like she'd been chewed up and spat out by the wasteland itself. But then he saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter of her chest. She was alive. Clay swore under his breath. This wasn't his problem. He didn't get involved. He didn't save people. He just survived. He was about to stand up, to get back on his horse and ride away, to let the desert finish what it had started. But then Bandit nudged the girl's tattered shirt with his nose. A low, sad whine escaped the dog's throat, and something small and silver fell out from under the cloth, glinting in the dying light. It was a chain, attached to a locket, a small, simple silver locket, charred black around the edges as if it had been pulled from a fire. Clay froze. The air left his lungs in a single, painful rush. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers suddenly feeling clumsy and numb. He'd know that locket anywhere. He'd bought it himself, in a town that was now just a ghost, for a woman who was now just a memory. He wiped the grime away with his thumb. The breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. It couldn't be. That locket had belonged to his wife, Miriam, the same locket he had placed around her neck before they buried her, 15 years ago. The desert heat vanished. A chill crawled up Clay's spine that had nothing to do with the coming night. He looked from the locket in his hand to the dying girl in the sand. The doctor had told him she'd died in childbirth. The doctor had told him the baby, a little girl, had been stillborn. He'd buried them both in the same grave. So how was her locket here? And who in God's name was this girl? Clay's mind was a storm, a whirlwind of questions with no answers. He fumbled with the locket's clasp, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It sprang open. Inside, one half of the locket held a tiny, scorched photograph. The edges were burned away, but he could still see the face. A soft smile, gentle eyes. Miriam. There was no doubt about it. The other side was empty. It had always been empty. They were supposed to put their daughter's picture there. He looked at the girl again, really looked this time. He brushed the matted dark hair from her face. Her skin was tanned and broken by the sun, but the shape of her mouth, it was just like Miriam's. "No," he whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "It can't be." But the desert didn't tell stories. It just held secrets. And this one felt big enough to swallow him whole. He scanned the area. No tracks, no wagon wheels, no sign of who left her here or why. It was as if she'd simply fallen from the sky, a broken angel dropped into his personal hell. He couldn't leave her. Not now. With a groan, he lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, nothing but skin and bone. She stirred, muttering something he couldn't understand, her body burning with fever. He had to move fast. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, holding her close with one arm, the reins tight in his other hand. "Hang on," he said, not sure if he was talking to her or to himself. The horse galloped north, towards the skeletal remains of a ghost town nestled in the shadow of the ridge. He'd stashed supplies there: water, medicine, a chance. As they rode, the girl didn't move. Clay kept a hand on her chest, feeling for the faint, fragile rhythm of her breath. A rhythm that felt terrifyingly similar to the one he'd lost 15 years ago. "You better not die," he muttered into the wind, his voice raw. "Not until you tell me where you got this." He touched the locket, now safely in his own pocket. "Not until I figure out who the hell you are." The ghost town rose up from the darkness like a collection of broken teeth. Shattered windows stared out like empty eye sockets. Rusted signs creaked in the wind, promising whiskey and hope to men long dead. Clay guided his horse to the old saloon, the biggest building still standing. He dismounted, carried the girl inside, and laid her gently on a long, dusty poker table. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Bandit paced by the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes scanning the shadows. He knew something was wrong. He could smell it. Clay worked with a grim efficiency. He found his supply box, pulling out a canteen and a clean blanket. He wet a cloth and placed it on her forehead, trying to fight the fever that was consuming her. He trickled water between her cracked lips. She coughed, her body convulsing weakly. Her eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with pain, but for a second they focused on him, on his face, and she whispered a single word. A name, maybe. It was too faint to be sure. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she was gone again. Clay stepped back, his heart pounding a frantic, chaotic beat. That look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was a flicker of recognition. He stood in the darkness of the ruined saloon, the silver locket cold in his hand, a hard knot of fear and impossible hope lodged in his throat. He had buried his wife. He had buried his child. The desert had taken everything from him. But now it felt like the desert was trying to give something back. Outside, the wind howled. Bandit let out a sharp, sudden bark, and Clay knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they weren't alone. Something was coming. This wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning. The first rays of dawn sliced through the saloon's grimy windows, illuminating a world of dust and decay. The girl gasped, her eyes snapping open. She stared at the fractured ceiling beams, confusion etched on her face. Clay was already awake. He sat across the room, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, his revolver resting on the table beside him. Bandit lay between them, a silent, watchful guardian. "You're awake," Clay said. His voice was flat, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside him. She tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her body. Her arms trembled. Where am I?" "Safe," he replied. "For now. You were dying out there." She nodded slowly, the memory returning in fractured pieces. "I remember. Walking. For days. Then, a dog." "Bandit," Clay said, tipping his head towards the mutt. "Found you just in time." Her eyes darted from the dog, back to Clay. A flicker of something crossed her face. Hesitation. Fear. She was trying to place him, trying to connect the dots in a mind still clouded by fever and exhaustion. Clay stood and walked to her side, offering his canteen. She drank greedily, her hands shaking so much he had to steady them. Then her gaze fell to her chest. Her eyes widened in panic. "The locket," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's gone." "I've got it," Clay said, pulling it from his shirt pocket. He saw the relief wash over her, quickly followed by suspicion. "Recognized it the second I saw it." Her breath hitched as he opened it, revealing the scorched photograph of Miriam. "That woman," the girl said, her voice barely audible. She's my mother. It's all I have of her. Someone gave this to me when I was little. Said she died when I was born." Clay's jaw clenched so tight he thought it might break. The past was a physical thing, a phantom fist squeezing the air from his lungs. He took a slow, deliberate breath. Her name was Miriam, he said, the words feeling like splinters in his throat. She was my wife. The girl's eyes went wide. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, ghostly white under the layers of dirt. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a graveyard. The silence of 15 years of unanswered questions finally crashing down on them both. Then that means, her voice trembled. That means you're my daughter, Clay finished for her. He expected tears. He expected questions. He expected a reunion, however broken and scarred. He did not expect the terror that flashed in her eyes. She scrambled backwards on the table, away from him, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. As if he wasn't her savior, but the devil himself. "What's your name?" he asked, his own voice sounding distant and strange. She shook her head, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. I don't have one. Not a real one. They just called me Dusty." Dusty, a name as cruel and fitting as the desert itself. Born of the earth, left to be scattered by the wind. "Why are you afraid of me?" Clay asked, the question tearing at him. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "The ones who had me, they told me stories about my father. They said he was a monster, a coward who left my mother to die. They said if he ever found me, he'd sell me too." The words hit Clay like a physical blow, a lie, a vicious, poisonous lie that had festered for 15 years. Who would say such a thing? And why? "Who told you that?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. She flinched. "It doesn't matter. They'll find me. They always do." A cold dread began to seep into Clay's bones. He'd seen the marks on her back when he'd cleaned her wounds. Thin, white scars that crisscrossed her skin. Whip marks. The desert didn't do that. She hadn't just been abandoned. She'd escaped. The tracks he'd seen near the pass. Wagon wheels, not old ones. The rumors he'd heard in the last town, whispers of a gang of slavers moving through the territory, led by a man with a reputation for cruelty. "Who was chasing you, Dusty?" he asked again, his tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, then her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "The one in charge. They call him Mace." Clay stiffened. The name was like a ghost story from his past. Mace Callister, a former Confederate raider who'd refused to surrender after the war, turning his savagery into a business. A man known for branding his property, both cattle and human. A man Clay thought he'd left behind in the blood and smoke of another lifetime. "Mace Callister," Clay said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Dusty's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and a new, more profound fear. How do you know his name?" The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random act of fate. Mace wasn't just chasing a runaway slave. He was coming for Clay. The name Mace Callister hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dusty stared at him, her fear now mixed with a dawning, terrible understanding. "You know him," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Clay ran a hand over his face, the years suddenly feeling like a crushing weight. "Knew him," he corrected her, his voice grim. "We rode on opposite sides of the war. His unit, they weren't soldiers. They were butchers. After it was all over, I heard he'd gone outlaw. Never thought I'd cross his path again." But it wasn't a cross path, was it? It was a collision course. Mace hadn't just stumbled upon Clay's daughter. He must have known. But how? How could he possibly know who Dusty was? Unless the lie she'd been told about her father wasn't just a random cruelty. It was a targeted poison, a story crafted to keep her afraid, to keep her from ever seeking him out. "Why were they keeping you?" Clay asked, though he already feared he knew the answer. The slavers didn't just take people. They took people who had something they wanted, or they took people to settle a score. "I don't know," she muttered, looking down at her hands. "I was just property. I got tired of waiting to die, so I ran." Clay stood up, the chair creaking in protest. He walked to the broken-down doorway of the saloon, peering out at the vast, empty expanse. But it wasn't empty. He knew that now. Death was riding toward them, and it had a name. "He'll come looking," Clay said, his back to her. "I know." Her voice was small, but there was a flicker of defiance in it. He turned to face her, really looking at her for the first time, not as a ghost from his past, but as a person, a survivor. She was somewhere between broken and unbreakable, forged in a fire he couldn't even imagine. She had Miriam's jawline, set with a stubbornness he recognized all too well. "You can't run forever, Dusty," he said softly. "I wasn't planning to," she replied, her eyes meeting his. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken weight of 15 lost years. Bandit, sensing the shift, trotted over to Dusty's side and rested his heavy head on her lap. She absently stroked his fur, a small, sad smile touching her lips for the first time. "Do you know how to shoot?" Clay asked. She shook her head. "Ride." "A little." He let out a slow breath. "We've got a day, maybe two. Then they'll be on us." She looked up at him, her eyes so much like her mother's, searching his face. "What are you going to do?" He met her gaze, and for the first time in 15 years, the fog of grief and regret began to clear. He had a purpose again. It was a terrible, violent purpose, but it was his. "What I should have done years ago," he said, his voice low and steady. "Protect my family." He saw the glint of tears in her eyes, but she quickly looked away, hiding them from him. He gave her that small mercy. The pieces were all there, but they didn't fit. Why would Mace Callister, a man from a war fought 1,000 miles away, have Clay's daughter? How did he even find her? And who was the person who gave Dusty the locket? It was a key. It had to be. A message from the grave. But what was it trying to unlock? Clay's mind raced back to that day. The small cabin, the frantic ride to fetch the doctor, the grim-faced man, Dr. Abernathy, who had met him on the porch hours later, his hands clean, his eyes cold. "I'm sorry, Mr. Maddox. There were complications. Your wife is gone. The child didn't make it either." Clay had been broken, hollowed out by a grief so profound he couldn't even bring himself to go inside, to see them. He'd let the doctor handle everything, the arrangements, the burial. He had simply stumbled away, into the wilderness, into the long, empty years that followed. He had trusted the doctor. The desert doesn't lie, but men do. A horrifying thought began to take root in his mind. A seed of suspicion so dark and monstrous, it made him feel sick to his stomach. What if the doctor had lied? What if Miriam hadn't died of complications? What if the baby hadn't been stillborn? He looked at Dusty, who was now carefully cleaning the revolver he'd placed on the table, her movements clumsy but determined. What if she hadn't been lost? What if she'd been sold? The thought was a venomous snake coiling in his gut. Could a man be so evil? To prey on a grieving husband? To steal a newborn child from her mother's arms? It seemed impossible. But Mace Callister was involved. And with a man like Mace, nothing was impossible. Abernathy. He remembered the doctor had family back east. But there were whispers, too. Whispers of gambling debts, of shady dealings. Clay had been too lost in his own sorrow to pay them any mind. Now they were screaming at him. "Dusty," he said, his voice urgent. "The person who gave you the locket. What did they look like? What did they say?" She looked up, startled. It was a woman in Mace's camp. She was old, sick, dying. She was always kind to me. One night she pulled me aside. She pressed the locket into my hand. Dusty's brow furrowed in concentration. She said, "This belonged to your mother. If you ever get free, find the man who gave it to her. Find Clay Maddox. He's your only hope." So the woman knew him. She knew about the locket. She had been a witness. "Did she say anything else?" Clay pressed. "Anything about your mother? About what happened?" Dusty's eyes clouded over. She said my mother didn't die giving birth to me. She said she died fighting for me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She said they killed her." The air in the saloon turned to ice. The world tilted on its axis. Miriam hadn't died in childbirth. She'd been murdered. And the doctor, Dr. Abernathy, he hadn't just lied. He'd been an accomplice. He'd covered it up. He'd sold Clay's baby girl to Mace Callister to pay off a debt. And when Miriam fought back, they killed her and buried the secret. They had buried an empty coffin. The grief that Clay had carried for 15 years transformed in an instant. It was no longer a weight. It was fuel. It was a white-hot righteous rage that burned away all the sorrow, all the regret, all the emptiness. He wasn't a grieving widower anymore. He wasn't a lost soul wandering the desert. He was a reckoning. He looked at his daughter, his beautiful, broken, surviving daughter, and he saw her mother's fire blazing in her eyes. "Get some rest," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion except a chilling, absolute certainty. "Tomorrow we don't make a stand." She looked at him, confused. "We go hunting." By sunrise, the saloon was no longer a sanctuary. It was an armory. Clay had laid out his entire arsenal, what little there was: 2 revolvers, a double-barreled shotgun with a cracked stock, and a long-barreled rifle he kept for hunting. There wasn't much ammunition. Every shot would have to count. He walked Dusty through the mechanics of each weapon, his voice a low, steady murmur. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to control her breathing. Her hands trembled at first, the cold weight of the steel a foreign and terrible thing. But as the sun climbed higher, a change came over her. The trembling stopped. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now held a sharp, focused intensity. She was a quick study. She had a survivor's instinct. "You've done this before?" she asked, snapping the revolver's chamber shut with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. "No," Clay replied, his gaze distant. "But I've seen men die because they hadn't. That's all the reason I needed to learn." They were no longer just a father and a daughter. They were soldiers preparing for a war they couldn't afford to lose. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't heavy with grief. It was taut with purpose. They were 2 halves of a single vengeful whole. Around midday, as the heat warped the air into shimmering waves, Clay was scanning the ridgeline through a crack in a boarded-up window. And then he saw it, a plume of dust on the horizon, too organized for the wind, too deliberate. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. Dusty didn't flinch. She picked up the shotgun, its weight seeming to settle her, to ground her. She moved to the window on the opposite side of the room. Bandit, sensing the tension, let out a low growl, his body pressed against Clay's leg. 7 riders. They moved with a lazy, arrogant confidence, like vultures circling a kill they knew couldn't escape. The man in the lead was unmistakable. He wore a long, black coat despite the blistering heat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, making him look like a phantom. Mace Callister. He reined his horse to a halt just outside the saloon, the other 6 fanning out behind him, a pack of wolves waiting for the signal to attack. "Clay Maddox!" Mace's voice boomed across the still air, a sound of gravel and malice. "I know you're in there, you old ghost. Saw the dog tracks. Figured you'd found my stray." Clay remained silent, his rifle steady in his hands. Mace chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I ain't come here for a fight, Clay. Hell, I'm doing you a favor. That girl is more trouble than she's worth. Just send her out, and we'll be on our way. No need for anyone else to get hurt." The lie was so blatant, so dripping with contempt, that Clay almost smiled. "She's not yours to take, Mace," Clay shouted back, his voice echoing from the saloon's dark interior. Another chuckle. "Still playing the hero, huh? Some things never change." Mace dismounted slowly, his movements casual, almost bored. But Clay saw the way his hand hovered near his pistol. "Last chance, Maddox. Send out my property." "You want her?" Clay yelled. "Come and get her." That was the signal. Mace dropped behind a water trough just as Clay's first shot splintered the wood where his head had been. The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets ripping through the saloon's thin walls, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. "Stay down," Clay yelled. Dusty was crouched low, the shotgun held tight to her shoulder. She was breathing fast, her knuckles white. She counted the shots just as he'd taught her, 1, 2, 3. A pause to reload. She rose up, aimed the wide barrel of the shotgun at a figure trying to flank the building, and pulled both triggers. The kick was brutal, slamming her back against the wall, but the roar of the gun was magnificent. The figure screamed and fell, clutching a leg shredded by buckshot. A bullet whizzed past Clay's ear, close enough to feel its heat. He fired back, a clean shot that sent another rider tumbling from his saddle. Bandit was a blur of fur and fury on the ground floor, barking and snarling, darting between shadows, making it impossible for Mace's men to know how many people were inside. Dusty reloaded, her hands now steady, her movements sure. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear rage. She saw another man taking cover behind a stack of barrels. She fired the revolver. Missed. The man grinned and raised his own pistol. A shot rang out from upstairs. The man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of surprise, as a dark hole appeared in his chest. He crumpled to the ground. Dusty looked up. Clay gave her a grim nod from the second-floor banister before turning his attention back to the fight. They were a team. The fight raged on, a whirlwind of smoke, noise, and death. 2 more of Mace's men went down. The odds were evening. Then Clay saw him. Mace. He'd crawled from behind the trough, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He wasn't aiming at Clay. He was aiming at the downstairs window, at Dusty. "Dusty, move!" Clay roared. She turned, saw the flash of Mace's pistol. But before she could react, another shape burst from the saloon doorway. Bandit, a low guttural snarl ripping from his throat, launched himself at Mace. The dog hit him like a cannonball, jaws sinking into the arm holding the gun. The shot went wild, shattering a window far to the left. Mace screamed in pain and rage, trying to shake the furious animal off his arm. It was the opening Clay needed. He took careful aim with the rifle, the world narrowing to the space between his eye and the sight. He didn't aim for the head. He didn't aim for the chest. He aimed for Mace's other hand, the one reaching for a second pistol. He fired. Mace howled, a sound of pure agony, as his hand exploded in a spray of red. He kicked Bandit away and stumbled backward, clutching his ruined arm and his shattered hand. The remaining 2 men saw their leader fall. The fight went out of them. They grabbed Mace, dragged him onto a horse, and galloped away, disappearing back into the desert as quickly as they had appeared. Silence fell. It was a deafening, ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of Bandit, who had taken a hard kick to the ribs. Dusty stood in the middle of the saloon, the revolver still smoking in her hand, her body trembling with adrenaline. Clay came down the stairs, his boots crunching on broken glass. He knelt beside Bandit, checking him over. A few bruised ribs, but he'd be okay. He looked up at his daughter, standing amidst the carnage, a warrior born from the dust. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with a weary pride. She didn't answer. She just stared at her hands, at the weapons she still held, as if she didn't recognize them as her own. She looked from her hands to the bodies lying still in the dirt outside. "It's over," Clay said gently, reaching to take the gun from her. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark and haunted. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He's still alive. This isn't over until we find that doctor." The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The saloon was a wreck, its walls pocked with bullet holes, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. They buried Mace's men in shallow graves behind the building, a grim task performed in silence under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. There was no ceremony, no words spoken. They were just ghosts returning to the dust. Dusty worked with a numb efficiency, her face a blank mask. The fire of the battle had cooled, leaving behind an icy resolve. She had crossed a line out there, and there was no going back. Clay watched her, seeing the shadow that now lived behind her eyes. It was a shadow he knew well. As dusk settled, casting long, purple shadows across the desert, they sat inside the ruined saloon, cleaning their weapons. Bandit lay by the hearth, his breathing shallow but steady. "I didn't want to kill anyone," Dusty said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the whisper of the wind through the broken windows. "Nobody ever does," Clay replied, not looking up from the rifle he was oiling. "But sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice. You can carry that weight, or you can let it crush you." He finally met her gaze. You learn to set it down when you need to. She nodded, though he wasn't sure she understood. How could she? She was just a girl who had been forced to become a killer to survive. What Mace said, she started, hesitating, that I was his property. He bought me. From Dr. Abernathy. Clay's hands stilled. He told you that? Over the years, he liked to remind me. He said the good doctor owed him a gambling debt. A big one. Said the doctor didn't have cash, but he had something better. A newborn baby nobody would miss. The pieces of the puzzle were slotting together, each one darker than the last. Abernathy hadn't just been an accomplice. He'd been the architect of this whole nightmare. Where is he now? Clay asked, his voice a low growl. This doctor. I don't know for sure, Dusty said, but I heard Mace talking once. Bragging. He said Abernathy got spooked after it all went down. Packed up in the middle of the night and disappeared. Headed for a town where nobody knew him. A place called Redemption. Redemption. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. A man who stole a child and covered up a murder, hiding in a town called Redemption. Mace is wounded, Clay said, thinking aloud. Badly. He'll need a doctor. A doctor he can trust to keep his mouth shut. Dusty's eyes widened as she understood. He's going there. He's going to Abernathy. It wasn't just a possibility. It was a certainty. Their paths were converging. All the lies, all the pain, all the years of suffering were leading to one place. We ride at first light, Clay said. But Dusty shook her head. No, we ride now. There was no arguing with her. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a burning impatience. She couldn't rest. She couldn't wait. Justice had been delayed for 15 years, and she wouldn't allow it another night. They gathered what little they had, ammunition, the last of the water, a few strips of dry jerky. They saddled the horses, their movements swift and silent in the moonlight. As Clay swung into his saddle, he paused, looking at his daughter. The pale light sculpted her face, making her look older, harder. She was no longer the broken girl he'd found in the sand. She was a force of nature, shaped by the cruelty of the world, now turning that cruelty back on its creators. Are you ready for this? He asked. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know what I was waiting for. They rode out into the night, two figures moving through the vast, silent darkness. They left the ghost town and its fresh graves behind them, a monument to the battle they had survived. But they weren't riding away from the fight. They were riding toward the war. Their destination was redemption, but they weren't seeking salvation. They were bringing hell with them. The ride to redemption was a long, punishing journey. They pushed the horses hard, speaking little, fueled by a shared, unspoken urgency. The desert landscape blurred into a monotonous tableau of rock and sand, the sun a merciless hammer overhead, the moon a cold, indifferent eye at night. During a brief stop to water the horses at a hidden spring, Clay noticed something. Tucked into Dusty's belt was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. He'd never seen it before. Where did you get that? He asked. She pulled it out, her fingers tracing its rough edges. The woman who gave me the locket. She made it for me. She said my mother used to carve things like this. Little birds, animals. Said she had a gentle soul. Clay's heart ached. He remembered. Miriam was always whittling, her hands never still. She could turn a block of worthless wood into something beautiful. It was a small detail, a forgotten memory, but it was proof. Another thread connecting this fierce, hardened young woman to the gentle soul who had given her life. She did, was all he could manage to say. Dusty tucked the bird away, a silent promise to the memory of a woman she'd never known. They reached the outskirts of Redemption 2 days later. It wasn't much of a town. A single dusty street lined with a dozen clapboard buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and, at the far end of the street, a small building with a neatly painted sign that made Clay's blood run cold. Dr. C. Abernathy, physician. He was here. He hadn't even bothered to change his name. The arrogance of it was staggering. Mace's men will be watching the town, Clay said, his voice low. We can't just ride in. We don't, Dusty replied, her eyes scanning the layout of the street. We wait. They found a concealed spot in the rocky hills overlooking the town, a perfect vantage point. From there they watched. They saw Mace's two remaining men patrolling the street, their anxiety palpable. They saw townspeople scurrying about their business, casting nervous glances at the unwelcome newcomers. And then they saw him. A man stepped out of the doctor's office, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief. He was older now, heavier, his hair gone to gray. But it was him, Dr. Abernathy. He looked like a respectable citizen, a pillar of the community, a lie in a clean suit. They waited until nightfall. The town grew quiet, the windows of the houses glowing yellow in the darkness. The doctor's office was the last light to go out. It's time, Clay whispered. They moved like shadows, leaving the horses behind. Bandit stayed at Dusty's heel, silent and watchful. They circled around the back of the town, using the darkness as their cloak. The back door to the doctor's office was unlocked. They slipped inside, the air thick with the cloying smell of antiseptic and fear. The main office was empty, but a faint line of light shone from beneath a door at the back of the room. Voices murmured from within. Clay held up a hand, motioning for Dusty to stay put. He crept toward the door, his revolver drawn, and listened. The bleeding has stopped, but the hand is useless, Abernathy was saying, his voice strained. The bullet shattered the bones. I've done all I can. It's enough, Mace's voice snarled, weak but full of venom. It's my left hand. I can still shoot, and I only need one good hand to deal with Maddox and that little brat. You have to leave, Mace, the doctor pleaded. If the town marshal finds out you're here. That old fool, Mace scoffed. He won't do anything. You, on the other hand, you should be worried. If Maddox finds you, what do you think he'll do when he learns the truth about his precious Miriam? There was a moment of terrified silence. Then Abernathy whispered, No one can know. That was the deal. The secret dies with us. Oh, it'll die with you, all right, Mace chuckled darkly. But maybe sooner than you think. That was enough. Clay kicked the door open. It flew off its hinges, crashing against the far wall. Mace was lying on a medical cot, his right arm bandaged, his left hand a mangled, bloody mess. Dr. Abernathy was standing beside him, a bottle of laudanum shaking in his hand. Both men froze, their faces a perfect picture of shock and terror. Evening, Doctor, Clay said, his voice as cold as a tombstone. His revolver was rock steady, aimed directly at Abernathy's chest. Before either of them could react, Dusty stepped into the room from behind Clay, the shotgun held at her hip, its twin barrels aimed squarely at Mace. Abernathy dropped the bottle. It shattered on the floor. Maddox, I don't understand. I think you do, Clay said. He took a step into the room, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. 15 years ago, you told me my wife and daughter died. You lied. Abernathy's face went white. He started to stammer, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. His guilt was a stench in the small room. Mace, however, started to laugh. It was a weak, gurgling sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. So the old dog finally figured it out. Took you long enough. He looked at Dusty, a cruel sneer on his face. Did he tell you how your mother begged for her life? Did he tell you how she screamed when we... Dusty cocked both hammers of the shotgun. The sound was deafening in the small space. Click. Click. Mace fell silent. You're going to tell me everything, Clay said to Abernathy, his voice dangerously quiet. Right now. Why you did it. The doctor started to sob, his body trembling. It was the debt. I owed him everything. He said he would ruin me, kill me. He knew you were coming into money, that you had land. He said a baby was worth a fortune on the black market. He told me to tell you the child was stillborn. It was supposed to be simple. But it wasn't, was it? Clay growled. No, Abernathy wept. Your wife, Miriam, she woke up. She saw them taking the baby. She fought back. She was so strong. She grabbed one of my surgical knives. Mace, he didn't mean to. He just tried to stop her. Liar, Mace spat from the cot. I meant to. She cut me. Nobody cuts me. Clay looked from the weeping, pathetic doctor to the snarling, unrepentant monster on the cot. 15 years of grief, 15 years of a life built on a lie, all because of the greed and cowardice of these two men. He looked at Dusty. Her face was stone. Her eyes were fixed on Mace, filled with a hatred so pure it was almost holy. "The locket," Dusty said, her voice shaking with rage. "The woman in your camp. You killed her too, didn't you? When you realized she'd help me." Mace just smiled, a broken, bloody grin. "Cleaning up loose ends." That was it. There were no more questions to be asked. No more truths to uncover. There was only the ending. "You don't get to live in a town called Redemption, Doctor," Clay said, his voice flat. He leveled his pistol. Abernathy squeezed his eyes shut. "Please. Mercy." But Clay wasn't looking at him. His gaze shifted to Mace. "He gets to go first." Mace's eyes widened. He tried to reach for the pistol on the bedside table, the one good hand scrabbling for the weapon. He was too slow. The room exploded in a deafening roar as the shotgun in Dusty's hands bucked and spat fire. The blast threw Mace back against the wall, his chest erupting in a spray of red. The sneer on his face was replaced by a look of profound surprise. He slid down the wall, leaving a wet, crimson smear, and lay still. The silence that followed was broken by a high-pitched scream. Abernathy, his face splattered with Mace's blood, turned and bolted for the back door. He never made it. Clay's revolver fired once, a single clean shot. The doctor crumpled to the floor, the truth finally dying with him. The smoke cleared. Clay and Dusty stood in the quiet, blood-soaked room, the bodies of their tormentors at their feet. It was over. 15 years of pain had ended in 15 seconds of brutal, final justice. Dusty lowered the shotgun, her hands shaking. She looked at the carnage, then at Clay. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of fear. It was a tear of release. Clay walked over to her and gently took the shotgun from her hands. He didn't say a word. He just put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. And for the first time, she leaned into him. They walked out of the back of the doctor's office, leaving the dead to the darkness. They didn't look back. The town of Redemption was asleep, oblivious to the justice that had been served in its shadows. They collected their horses and rode out into the desert, the first hints of dawn painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. They rode until the town was just a speck behind them, until it was swallowed by the vastness of the land. They stopped at the top of a high mesa. The world spread out before them. The desert, which had once been Clay's prison, now looked different. It looked like a beginning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. It was dented and tarnished, but it had survived. He handed it to her. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this," he said. She took it, her fingers closing around the warm metal. She opened it and looked at the scorched picture of Miriam. "Dusty," Clay said softly, "it's a name the desert gave you. You don't have to keep it if you don't want to." She looked at him, a small, true smile finally reaching her eyes. "I know," she said, "but I think I will. It reminds me that I can survive anything." She looked out at the rising sun. "What do we do now?" Clay looked at the horizon, at the endless possibility of the open land. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man riding toward a future, with the only thing that mattered in the world beside him. "Whatever we want," he said. And they rode on, father and daughter, two survivors who had walked through hell and found each other in the ashes. The desert doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you a second chance. The story of Clay and Dusty is a reminder that even in the most desolate of places, hope can take root. It's a story about family, survival, and a bond forged in fire and paid for in blood. If their journey moved you, and you believe that justice is always worth fighting for, then hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments below. What name would you have chosen? Until next time, remember that even the hardest trails can lead you home.